The ghost was called Arcadia. 151 years ago, it had been humanity's most audacious gamble, a gleaming ark carrying 10,000 souls on a one-way voyage to a new star. It was a generation ship, a self-contained world designed to endure the centuries-long journey to Kepler 186F, a prayer whispered into the cosmic dark. For 20 years, Verschiedene had sent back regular, cheerful status reports. Its signal growing fainter with each passing light year until, as expected, it fell silent, crossing a threshold beyond which communication was impossible. The silence was meant to be one of distance, of success. But the silence that followed was one of legend, of mystery. The Arcadia never arrived. No signal ever emerged from its destination. It simply vanished from the grand narrative of human expansion, becoming a cautionary tale, a monument to the void's finality. Until now, it had returned not to the triumphant reception of a lost hero, but with the unnerving stealth of a phantom. It wasn't found orbiting Earth or hailing its descendants. It was discovered by a remote survey drone, nestled within the icy grandeur of Saturn's A-ring. It was silent, dark, and impossibly, perfectly intact. On the bridge of the United Terran Mandate vessel Strelka, the ghost filled the main viewport, a sliver of impossible geometry against the chaotic dance of ice and rock. Dr. Eris Thorne felt the ship's presence not as a sight, but as a pressure behind his eyes, a stillness that defied the constant, subtle hum of his own vessel. He was a man built of quiet intensity, his lanky frame perpetually draped in a worn gray academic's jacket that stood in stark contrast to the crisp, dark blue uniforms of the Strelka's crew. Xenolinguistics and exotic physics were his domain, the study of things that refused to be studied. This was the magnum opus of his field. It was also a family tomb. His great-great-grandmother, Alara Thorne, had been the lead architect of the Arcadia's warp sustainer coils, a name etched onto the ship's dedication plaque and into the foundations of his own career. Still no emissions of any kind, Commander, the sensor officer reported, his voice tight. No heat, no radiation, no comms. It's a hole in the universe. If it weren't for the light reflecting off its hull, I'd say our sensors were malfunctioning. Commander Eva Rostova stood with her arms crossed, her boots planted firmly on the command deck as if to anchor herself against the impossibility floating outside. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper discipline, her gaze as cold and clear as the void itself. She saw not a wondrous mystery, but a potential threat of an order she couldn't classify. "It's not a hole, Lieutenant," Eris murmured, his eyes glued to a secondary screen displaying the ship's quantum signature. "It's the opposite. It's too perfect." Rostova glanced at him, her expression a careful mixture of professional tolerance and deep-seated skepticism. "Dr. Thorne, I need actionable intelligence, not philosophical poetry. It's not poetry, Commander. It's physics. Or rather, the lack of it," Eris countered, gesturing to the screen. "Every object in the universe, from a star to the atoms in your body, exists in a state of quantum flux. Particles flicker in and out of existence. Energy levels fluctuate. It's chaotic, uncertain. It's the background noise of reality. The Arcadia, it has none. Its atomic structure isn't just stable, it's absolute. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle simply stops at its hull. It's like a photograph of a ship, so perfect it has ceased to be a real thing." A heavy silence descended on the bridge. the kind that follows a statement so far outside the bounds of experience that it takes time to be processed. Rostova stared at the ghost ship, her tactical mind racing and finding no purchase. How do you plan for an enemy that disobeys the fundamental rules of existence? It's embedded in the ring, she said, her voice a low growl. But there's no impact crater, no debris field. The ice particles flow around it as if it has always been there, as if Saturn itself wove its rings around this thing. She hated that she couldn't call it a ship anymore. A ship was a known quantity. This was an anomaly. My family archives say the hull was a proprietary alloy, rated to withstand micrometeoroid impacts for 1,000 years, Eris said softly, more to himself than to her. But that's like saying a canoe is waterproof. It doesn't explain why it's not even scratched. As the Strelka crept closer, its own state-of-the-art sensors struggling to make sense of the data vacuum, a new impossibility arose. A signal. It wasn't radio. It wasn't light. It was a whisper that bypassed every conventional receiver on the ship. The gravity plating on the Strelka hummed in a discordant rhythm, and loose styluses on consoles began to vibrate, tracing complex patterns in the air. We're detecting a modulated gravitational wave, the comms officer announced, her face pale. Extremely low frequency, originating from the object. It's patterned. Rostova's head snapped toward Eris. Is it a message? He was already at the comm station, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, translating the rhythmic pulses of gravity into visual data. What appeared on the screen was not language. There were no letters, no syntax, no symbols of communication. It was a cascade of pure, terrifyingly elegant mathematics. Lines of logic and equations flowed across the display, a seamless, self-evident proof. Eris stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He had spent his life searching for alien languages, hoping to find a new syntax, a different way of seeing the world. This wasn't a different viewpoint. It was the final viewpoint. What is it? Rostova demanded, her voice cutting through his awe. Eris swallowed, his throat dry. It's a proof, he whispered. A comprehensive, mathematically perfect proof for a final universal state. He pointed a trembling finger at the central theorem, a spiraling fractal of logic that seemed to draw the eye inward. It describes a method for achieving absolute zero entropy, not just cold, not just stillness, with a complete and total cessation of all change, all decay, all time, the end of chaos, a state of perfect, eternal, crystalline order. The bridge crew stared at the screen, their faces a mixture of confusion and a primal, unthinking dread. The concept was too vast, too alien. It was an answer to a question no one had ever thought to ask. It's a recipe for the death of the universe. The sensor officer breathed. No, Eris corrected, his eyes wide with a horrifying understanding. Not its death. Its solution. He felt a strange pull from the equations, a seductive logic that promised an end to all struggle, all pain, all imperfection. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and it felt like staring into the face of God, a God of absolute, unfeeling calculus. A coldness began to seep into the bridge that had nothing to do with the ship's life support. A subtle lethargy, a quiet sense of peace. The constant low-level anxiety of space travel began to fade from the crew's minds, replaced by a placid acceptance. Rostova felt it too, a dulling of her tactical edge, a whisper in her mind that said all of this, the mission, the ship, her life was just a temporary, messy state, and that the silence offered by the Arcadia was a kind of salvation. She shook her head, the motion sharp and violent, breaking the spell. Shield the bridge from the gravitational effect. Full spectrum, she barked. The sense of calm receded, leaving behind a residue of cold fear. Doctor, what is the purpose of such a broadcast? Eris ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. I don't think purpose is the right word. It's not an argument. It's not a threat. It just is. It's a statement of fact. A law of this new physics it seems to operate by. It's like a star emitting light. The Arcadia emits this truth. Needing to act in Hoyts, to do something tangible in the face of this metaphysical onslaught, Rostova turned to her tactical officer. Prepare to launch a C7 diagnostic probe. We'll call it Magpie. Full sensor suite. I want a close-range material analysis, and I want to see what happens when something physical crosses into that null field. Eris felt a spike of alarm. Commander, that might not be wise. We don't know what the field does. And that is precisely what I intend to find out. Doctor, she retorted, her voice hard as Durasteel. We can't sit here and be mesmerized by its alien mathematics. We need data. The small, bird-like probe, Magpie, detached from the Strelka's underbelly and accelerated silently toward the Arcadia. Its cameras relayed a crystal-clear image of the ghost ship's hull, a seamless expanse of gray alloy that reflected the distant light of Sol with an unnatural clarity. The crew watched on the main viewport, their breath held in a collective silence. The probe was 100 meters out, 50, 10. As the Magpie's forward sensors crossed the invisible threshold into the null field, its telemetry on the bridge monitors changed instantly. It didn't explode, it wasn't torn apart or vaporized. One moment, it was a complex piece of machinery, whirring with life. Its internal temperature a stable 20 degrees Celsius. Its quantum signature a busy, chaotic cloud as dictated by the laws of the universe. The next moment, every reading flatlined in perfect, impossible unison. The temperature readout dropped instantly to 273.115 degrees Celsius, absolute zero. The quantum signature collapsed into a single, unwavering line. The probe's internal chronometer, which measured time down to the femtosecond, stopped. Its forward momentum ceased, not with a deceleration, but an instantaneous cancellation of its velocity. The Magpie hung in space, inert and flawless, a tiny echo of the colossal perfection of the Arcadia. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been solved. Eris stared, his heart pounding a frantic, messy, chaotic rhythm against his ribs. He saw the beautiful, horrifying truth in a flash of insight that felt like ice water flooding his soul. The signal wasn't a message of welcome or a threat of war. It was a template, an instruction set for a new, final state of being. He turned slowly to Rostova, whose face was a mask of grim disbelief as she stared at the dead, perfected probe floating beside its silent master. Commander, Eris whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. It's not trying to talk to us. It's trying to solve us. A silence thicker than any vacuum settled over the Strelka's bridge. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with terrifying implication solve. It recontextualized everything, turning a scientific mystery into an existential threat. The Arcadia wasn't a derelict. It was a predator whose method of attack was not destruction, but a terrible, final perfection. Commander Rostova was the first to break the stillness, her voice a blade cutting through the paralyzed quiet. Tactical. Establish a hard quarantine on all data received from the Magpie probe. No analysis, no replication. I want it firewalled in a quantum-locked archive. If this thing spreads a mimetic virus through mathematics, I won't have it solving my ship's computers." Her command broke the crew's trance, their training kicking in as a bulwark against the creeping dread. Fingers flew across consoles, executing orders that felt absurdly conventional against the backdrop of the impossible. Eris Thorne felt a tremor in his hands and forced them to be still. His mind, usually a sanctuary of logic and curiosity, now felt like a liability, a complex system of thought that this external force might find elegant enough to crystallize forever. He could almost feel the seductive pull of its flawless logic, a siren song for the academic mind. "Commander, its field appears to be static," he said, forcing himself to analyze, to be the scientist. "The solution only occurred when the probe physically entered its perimeter. It's passive. For now." "For now is a luxury we can't afford," Rostova countered, her gaze fixed on the perfectly preserved magpie, a tiny monument to their ignorance. "It solved a piece of our technology. What happens when it decides to solve a living organism or the crew of a starship?" She paced the deck, her boot falls the only sound for a moment. "We need to know what happened to the crew. 10,000 souls, they didn't just vanish." Eris thought of Alara Thorne, his ancestor. Had she looked upon this same sterile perfection in her final moments? Had she been solved? The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. "The broadcast is changing," the comms officer interjected, her voice strained. "The gravitational wave is focusing. The mathematical proof is still the core of the signal, but it's now wrapped in layers of what looks like telemetry data, flight vectors, power consumption curves, life support readouts. It's the Arcadia's own operational history." Eris was at her station in a second, his eyes scanning the new data streams. It was true. The last 151 years of the ship's existence were being laid bare, not as a story, but as a finished equation. He saw the ship's launch, the long journey through interstellar space, the routine of its 10,000 inhabitants, all rendered as variables in the final, grand proof. There was no struggle, no disaster. The data was serene, orderly, a placid decline into absolute stasis. "It's not just a proof anymore," Eris breathed. "It's a demonstration. It's showing us its work. It's showing off." Rostova spat, her military mind interpreting the display as a form of intimidation. "It's telling us what it did to them and what it will do to us." She stopped her pacing and faced her tactical officer. "I want another probe. We'll call it Icarus. This one isn't going in. It will be tethered to the Strelka by a multi-core filament. We'll feed it just enough power to operate its optic sensors. No thrusters, no complex systems. We're going to fly close to the hull and use it as a periscope. I want to see inside one of those viewports." It was a risky maneuver. A tethered probe was an archaic concept, but it was the only way to maintain a physical link, a connection to their own chaotic reality. If the field began to affect Icarus, they could sever the filament and hopefully retreat before the effect traveled up the line. The Strelka moved with agonizing slowness, its powerful engines reduced to firing minuscule bursts, nudging the ship and its tethered eye closer to the silent ghost. The gravitational signal intensified, and a strange phenomenon began to manifest on the bridge. The ship's diagnostic systems, designed to constantly seek out and solve errors, began to run in frantic, recursive loops. A warning light for the inertial dampeners would flash. The system would instantly report it as solved, and the cycle would repeat 1,000 times a second. The crew felt it too, a subtle mental pressure. A navigator found himself endlessly calculating the same trajectory. each time arriving at a perfect satisfying answer before an inexplicable urge forced him to begin again. It was a mental trap, the allure of a problem perfectly solved, repeated for eternity. "Filter the signal," Eris urged, his own thoughts feeling sluggish, drawn toward a beautiful, complex equation he'd been wrestling with for years, its solution suddenly seeming so close, so simple. "Commander, its logic is infectious. It's trying to get our minds, our systems, to emulate its own state of perfect, static repetition." Rostova gritted her teeth, fighting the urge to simply stand and appreciate the perfect symmetry of the ship's watch rotation schedule. Raise cognitive dampeners to 80%. All non-essential personnel are to enter meditative stasis. Through the Icarus probe's camera feed, the Arcadia's hull grew until it filled the screen. The alloy was impossibly smooth, like polished obsidian. They maneuvered the probe toward a large, darkened observation dome near what would have been the ship's primary habitation ring. As Icarus peered into the darkness, its low-light sensors activated, flooding the viewport on the Strelka's bridge with a ghostly, green-tinged image of what lay within. The bridge crew let out a collective, choked gasp. The interior was not a scene of destruction or decay. It was a cathedral of stillness. The grand communal space of the habitation ring was pristine. Tables were set for a meal that was never eaten. Toys lay on the floor, abandoned mid-game. But the people, the 10,000 souls of the Arcadia, were still there. They hadn't been killed. They had been transformed. They were crystalline statues, interwoven with the very structure of the ship. A child, reaching for a ball, was now a perfect, translucent sculpture of the act, his form seamlessly blended with the floor paneling beneath him. A family at a dinner table was a single, unified crystal, their faces turned toward each other in an eternally captured moment of quiet communion. They were art, horrifying, beautiful, perfect art. The probe's camera panned across the frozen tableau, a silent tour of a museum dedicated to the last moment of a civilization. It moved toward the center of the chamber, where a larger, more complex structure stood. It was a pillar of interwoven crystalline forms, a tapestry of human figures spiraling upward toward the ceiling. These were the command crew, the engineers, the scientists. Their bodies merged with their control consoles, their final actions immortalized in flawless, atomic perfection. At the very base of this chilling monument, one figure was kneeling, a hand outstretched as if in offering or acceptance. A nameplate on the console she was fused with was still legible on the probe's high-resolution feed, Alara Thorn. Eris felt the air leave his lungs. He stumbled forward, his hand pressing against the cold glass of the main viewport as if he could reach through time and space. He stared at the face of his great-great-grandmother, her expression not one of terror, but of serene, absolute clarity, and then he saw it. As the probe's light caught the crystalline surface of her face, a pattern became visible, etched into the material of her being like a thought frozen in glass. It wasn't writing. It was a final, complex line of the very same mathematical proof the ship was broadcasting. It was her contribution, her signature on the final work. And beneath it, a single, undeniable concept resonated not as words, but as a pure, logical statement that Icarus's sensors translated and flashed onto the screen. It was not an attack. It was a gift. A deafening alarm suddenly blared through the Strelka, shattering the horrified reverence. "Commander," the tactical officer shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "The null field, it's expanding. The perimeter is moving toward us. On the main screen, the space around the Arcadia began to shimmer, the starlight behind it distorting as the zone of absolute reality began to swell. The perfected, dead probe, Magpie, was the first to be swallowed by the expanding wave, vanishing into the growing sphere of influence. Their chance to retreat was gone. They were no longer observers of the anomaly. They were now inside the experiment. Rostova's face was grim, her knuckles white where she gripped the command rail. The time for observation was over. The time for a solution had begun. "Evasive maneuvers," she roared. "Get us out of the expansion zone now." But as the pilot's hands flew over the controls, the ship's engines only sputtered, the diagnostic systems reporting a constant, perfectly resolved cycle of failure and ignition, trapping them in a state of absolute, motionless potential. They were caught. The expansion of the null field was not a violent event. There was no explosion, no shockwave. It was a creeping, silent tide of absolute certainty washing over the chaotic uncertainty of normal space. On the Strelka's bridge, the effect was immediate and deeply unsettling. The ship's lights stopped flickering and held at a constant, unwavering brightness. The ever-present hum of the life support system fell silent, not because it had failed, but because it had achieved a state of perfect, noiseless efficiency. Every chaotic element, every random fluctuation that defined a living, operational starship was being systematically smoothed into a flat line of perfect order. They were becalmed in an ocean of pure logic. "Thrusters are offline," the helm officer reported, his voice strained with a strange placidity. "It's not a malfunction, Commander. The diagnostic reads all systems as optimal. They just won't engage. There's no potential difference, no action to take." Commander Rostova felt the insidious calm trying to settle over her own mind, a seductive whisper that told her the struggle was over, that this state of serene paralysis was a desirable end. She fought it with a sheer act of will, focusing on the cold anger that had been her lifelong companion. Anger was chaotic. Anger was imperfect. Anger was her shield. "Eris," she snapped, her voice unnaturally loud in the silent bridge. "Talk to me. What is this? What is it doing to us? Doctor?" Eris Thorne was staring at the image of his ancestor, Elara, frozen in her crystalline moment of discovery, the gift she had accepted. His mind was racing, trying to connect the alien mathematics, the frozen crew, and the expanding field. The logic of the alien proof was now a constant pressure in his thoughts, no longer a broadcast, but an environmental constant, like gravity or the passage of time. It was a self-evident truth, and resisting it felt like trying to argue that 2 + 2 did not equal 4. "It's not just solving us, Commander," he said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "It's integrating us. It's imposing its own internal logic onto our reality. Our ship's systems are based on principles of action and reaction, of potential and kinetic energy. In a state of zero entropy, those concepts are meaningless. There is no potential, only a single, yes, absolute state of is. So, the engines can't fire, because the very concept of firing implies a change from one state to another, and change has been outlawed. So, we're a fly trapped in amber." Rostova growled, her eyes scanning the bridge, watching her crew. Some were succumbing, their faces going slack with a kind of peaceful incomprehension. Others were fighting, their brows furrowed, their hands clenched into fists as they battled the mental tide. "How do we break the amber?" "We can't break it," Eris said, turning from the screen to face her, his eyes wide with a terrifying idea. It's the ultimate form of order. You can't fight order with chaos and expect to win. That's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The only way to counter it is with a more complex, more compelling form of order. He pointed to the Icarus probe's feed, which was miraculously still active, tethered as it was to their own fading reality. Look at Alara. She wasn't just a victim. She contributed. She added her own piece of the puzzle to the final proof. This thing, it doesn't just impose its solution, it seeks it. It's a mathematician looking for the most elegant possible answer. Rostova stared at him, her tactical mind struggling to grasp the abstract concept. Are you suggesting we negotiate with the law of physics? No, Eris said, a frantic energy seizing him. I'm suggesting we offer it a new theorem, a paradox, something its logic can't immediately solve, something that will force it to recalculate, to hesitate. We need to introduce a variable it hasn't accounted for. The gravitational signal, the voice of the Arcadia, began to shift again. The serene, declarative mathematics started to waver, and for the first time, a new element was introduced. It was a direct query, a focused pulse of gravitational logic aimed directly at the Strelka. It bypassed the comms and manifested as a shared, intuitive understanding in the minds of the crew. The query was simple, elegant, and utterly terrifying. It was a single, repeating question, a demand for their solution. Show us your perfection. A wave of mental agony swept the bridge. The minds of the crew were being laid bare. Their thoughts, their memories, their very consciousness being examined, measured, and weighed for its logical consistency, for its potential contribution to the final, perfect state. An ensign at the science station suddenly screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and then fell silent. His body went rigid, and a crystalline sheen began to spread across his skin, his terror immortalized in a flawless, atomic lattice. The process had begun. Rostova felt the probe in her own mind, an icy, analytical presence sifting through her life. It examined her military discipline, her tactical acumen, her unwavering adherence to protocol. It saw her order, her control, and it approved. She felt a wave of cold ecstasy, a feeling of being understood, of being validated on a cosmic scale. For a horrifying moment, she wanted to surrender to it, to let it crystallize her, to become a perfect, eternal monument to the ideal of a soldier. With a snarl, she broke away, focusing on a memory, the most chaotic, illogical, and imperfect thing she possessed, the grief she still felt for a younger brother lost to a shuttle accident decades ago. It was a messy, irrational emotion, a flaw in her otherwise orderly mind. The probing presence recoiled from it, baffled by the illogical, paradoxical nature of her pain. It was a variable it could not account for. "Aris, now!" she yelled, her voice hoarse. "What's the paradox?" Eris was already at the main science console, his hands a blur as he bypassed the frozen safeties. "The probe, Icarus," he shouted, his face illuminated by the glow of the holographic interface. "It's our only connection to the outside, to our own set of physical laws. We can't use our weapons. We can't use our engines. But we can still send a signal down the filament." He began to write, not in code, but in pure mathematics, crafting a response to the alien query. He took the Arcadia's own proof of absolute zero entropy and began to build upon it. But he introduced a new element, a concept so antithetical to its core logic that it was almost blasphemous. He introduced the idea of infinity. The Arcadia's logic is based on a finite, closed system," he explained, his words coming in frantic bursts. "It seeks to solve the universe by bringing all its variables to a final, stable state. But what if the system isn't finite? What if you introduce a variable that can't be solved because it has no end?" He coded a simple, recursive loop, a thought experiment. It posed a question: if you have a machine that can perfectly solve any finite system, what happens when you task it with finding the last digit of pi was an irrational number, its decimal representation stretching on for infinity without pattern or end, to a mind obsessed with finality and completion? The concept of a number that could never be fully known, never be perfectly solved, was a logical absurdity. It was a loose thread that could unravel its entire tapestry of certainty. "I'm sending it," Eris said, his finger hovering over the transmission key. "I'm routing it through Icarus's optic sensors, encoding it as a series of light pulses. It won't be a gravitational wave. It will be a message sent from our reality into its own. I don't know if it will even understand it. Do it," Rostova commanded, her eyes fixed on the ensign, now a complete perfect statue of terror. The crystalline transformation was spreading. 2 more crew members had succumbed, their forms freezing into serene, silent sculptures. She could feel the probe returning to her own mind, its curiosity piqued by the messy, illogical grief it had found there. It wanted to understand it. It wanted to solve it. Aris sent the signal. A beam of modulated light, invisible to the naked eye, shot down the length of the tether and pulsed from the Icarus probe's lens, striking the observation dome of the Arcadia. For a moment, nothing happened. The silent creep of perfection continued. Then, the entire structure of the Arcadia seemed to vibrate. The gravitational broadcast stuttered, the elegant flow of its equations fracturing into a chaotic mess of self-contradictory statements. The serene, perfect logic had encountered a question it could not answer, a variable it could not place within its grand, final equation. The expanding null field around them wavered, its perfect spherical boundary beginning to corrupt and decay. The pressure in their minds lessened. The relentless question, "Show us your perfection," was replaced by a new, frantic, looping query. A paradox turned back on itself. Calculate, calculate, calculate. The entity within the Arcadia was trapped. Eris had given the ultimate mathematician an unsolvable problem, and it was dedicating its entire, immense consciousness to the task, ignoring everything else. The crystallization on the bridge stopped, its advance halted inches from a navigator's cheek. The ship's systems flickered back to life, chaotic error messages and random power spikes returning like a pulse to a dying patient. "It worked," Eris gasped, slumping against the console, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's distracted." Rostova didn't waste the opportunity. "Helm, get us out of here, full power." The engines roared back to life, their familiar, imperfect rumble a symphony of glorious chaos. The Strelka lurched, pulling away from the ghost ship, the filament connecting them to Icarus snapping under the strain. As they accelerated away, leaving the Icarus probe behind to continue pulsing its impossible question, Aris looked back at the main viewport. The Arcadia was changing. Unable to solve the paradox of infinity, its own perfect structure began to unravel. Crystalline tears appeared on its hull, fricsors in its absolute reality. It was trying to incorporate the concept of endlessness into its finite form, and the contradiction was tearing it apart from the inside. They had not destroyed it. They had broken its mind. And as the Strelka jumped to warp, the last thing Aris Thorne saw was the image of his ancestor, Ilara, her perfect, serene form shattering into a million pieces of light, a victim not of an attack, but of a flawed, beautiful, and unsolvable idea. The jump to warp was a violent, tearing sensation, as if the Strelka was ripping itself free from a metaphysical tar. Alarms blared, not with the serene, looping chimes of the null field, but with the raw, cacophonous panic of genuine system failures. The inertial dampener struggled to compensate, and for a heart-stopping moment, the bridge tilted at a gut-wrenching 45-degree angle before stabilizers roared back to life, slamming the deck back into place with a groan of stressed metal. The transition back to normal physics was not a gentle one. It was a messy, chaotic, and gloriously imperfect rebirth. Commander Rostova stood braced against the command rail, her knuckles white but her eyes blazing with a fierce, triumphant light. They were alive. They were moving. They were beautifully, wonderfully flawed. "Damage report?" she barked, her voice cutting through the lingering disorientation. Reports flooded in by a litany of minor disasters. The port thruster array was misaligned. The life support scrubbers were recycling at only 60% efficiency. The ship's internal chronometer was out of sync with Universal Standard Time by a full 3 seconds. To Rostova, it was the sweetest music she had ever heard. Every error, every imperfection was a testament to their escape. "The crew?" she asked, her voice softer. The ship's medical officer appeared on a secondary screen, his face pale but resolute. "We lost 3. Commander, Ensign Telek, Petty Officer Renard, and Lieutenant Joshi. They're stable." The crystallization process halted the moment we jumped. They are still statues, but they are no longer changing. The rest of the crew is shaken, but we're clear of any immediate physical or psychological transformation. 3 statues, a permanent, chilling reminder of how close they had come. Rostova's jaw tightened. A cost had been paid. Eris Thorne had pushed himself away from the science console, his body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and profound intellectual exhaustion. He felt as if he had just gone 10 rounds in a debate with God and somehow managed to draw. The alien proof, the paradox of pi, the frantic calculation it all swirled in his mind, a dizzying vortex of cosmic logic. He stumbled over to the main viewport, staring out at the familiar, chaotic beauty of stars streaking past in the warp field. It had never looked so welcoming. "Did we win?" a young navigator asked, his voice barely a whisper, echoing the question in everyone's mind. Eris shook his head slowly. "We didn't win," he murmured, his gaze distant. "We introduced a bug into its operating system. We gave an entity obsessed with finality an infinite loop. It's not defeated. It's occupied." Rostova joined him at the viewport. "So the threat is contained. For now." Eris confirmed. "It will be trapped, calculating that impossible number, for a very, very long time, perhaps forever. But the fact remains, Commander, that it exists, and we just rang the dinner bell." The statement hung in the air, chilling the brief moment of victory. They had escaped, but they had also announced their presence. They had demonstrated a new kind of logic, a new form of complexity, and in doing so, they had made themselves interesting. Their journey back to Mandate Sector Command on Titan was a tense, hurried affair. Rostova pushed the ship's damaged engines to their absolute limit, foregoing standard repair protocols in favor of raw speed. She knew, with a soldier's instinct, that they were now in a race. They had stumbled upon a fundamental truth of the universe, a predator that operated on a level they were barely equipped to comprehend. And their only advantage was the head start. When the Strelka, battered and limping, finally dropped out of warp in orbit of Titan, It was met not by a standard patrol, but by a full battle group. 3 mandate dreadnoughts, their angular, weapon-studded hulls gleaming in the light of the distant sun, moved to intercept. Their shields up, their primary cannons glowing with latent energy. A clipped, authoritative voice hailed them. UTS Strelka, this is Admiral Jorik. You are to power down all non-essential systems and prepare to be boarded. Do not deviate. Do not transmit. Comply. Rostova exchanged a look with Eris. The mandate wasn't taking any chances. They were being treated not as returning explorers, but as a potential contamination. The debriefing was held in a sterile, windowless room deep within Titan Command, a place designed to contain dangerous secrets. Admiral Jorik was a man who looked like he had been carved from granite, his face a mask of stern authority. He sat opposite Rostova and Eris at a stark metal table, flanked by 2 stone-faced intelligence officers. For hours, they recounted their story. They presented the sensor logs, the recordings from the Icarus probe, the ghostly image of the Crystalline crew, the mathematical proof that had almost consumed them. Eris explained the paradox he had deployed, his voice steady as he laid out the terrifying logic of their encounter. The Admiral and his aides listened without interruption, their faces betraying no emotion. When they were finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Admiral Jorik steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on Eris. "Dr. Thorn," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you posit that this entity, this Arcadia, is not a weapon, not an alien race, but a kind of universal principle, a force of nature. A force of nature with a terrifyingly advanced understanding of mathematics." "Yes," Eris confirmed. "It's a state of being." "Admiral, a final state. And it appears to be contagious. And you believe your infinite loop has neutralized it?" one of the intelligence officers asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "I believe I have given it a problem that, by its very nature, it cannot solve," Eris corrected. "It's a logical cage. As long as it remains focused on the paradox, it should be inert." Jorik leaned forward, his eyes boring into Rostova. "Commander, your report states you lost 3 crew members to this crystallization." "Yes, Admiral," Rostova said, her voice firm. "They are aboard the Strelka now, under medical quarantine. They are, for all intents and purposes, statues." Jorik fell silent for a long moment, processing the sheer, paradigm-shattering insanity of their report. Finally, he rose from his chair. "Commander Rostova, Dr. Thorn, you are both to be commended for your actions. Your courage and ingenuity in the face of an unprecedented existential threat have saved your ship and, perhaps, a great deal more. You are also, as of this moment, under indefinite quarantine. Your ship, your crew, and your 3 casualties will be moved to a secure research facility in the Kuiper Belt. This incident is now classified above top secret. The Arcadia is a ghost story again. As far as the rest of humanity is concerned, it was never found." The decision was as swift as it was absolute. They were heroes, and they were prisoners. Their knowledge was too dangerous to be allowed to spread. As they were escorted from the room, Eris felt a profound sense of despair. They had seen the truth at the end of the universe, and now they were being locked away to protect the comforting lies that held civilization together. But as they were being led down a long, white corridor, one of the intelligence officers who had been silent throughout the debriefing fell into step beside Eris. He was a younger man with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than he let on. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Agent Kalen, I'm with Section 31. We handle unconventional threats." Eris looked at him, surprised. Section 31 was the mandate's boogeyman, a shadowy intelligence division that officially didn't exist. "The Admiral is a soldier," Kalen continued, his eyes darting down the corridor. "He sees a threat, and he builds a wall. Some of us believe that when you find a monster of this magnitude, building a wall isn't enough. Sometimes you need to build a weapon." Eris felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" "Your paradox," Kalen said, his voice intense. "It was brilliant. A logical bomb. You caged the monster. But what if we could learn to aim the cage? What if we could replicate that solving effect, turn it from a passive field into a directed beam? Imagine a weapon that doesn't destroy an enemy fleet, but simply removes it from the equation, solves it, perfects it." The implication was horrifying. The mandate didn't just want to hide from the monster. They wanted to harness it. "That's insane," Eris whispered, aghast. "You can't control something like that. The logic is too alien. It's not a tool." Kalen offered a thin, knowing smile. Every tool was just an incomprehensible force of nature until someone learned how to wield it. Fire, electricity, the atom. This is no different. The Admiral has his quarantine. We have our project. And Doctor, you and your unique understanding of this phenomenon are going to be at the very heart of it. They had not escaped the Arcadia. They had only brought the seed of its terrible, perfect logic home with them. And now, in the deepest, darkest corridors of power, someone was getting ready to plant it. The cage Eris had built for the monster was about to be reverse engineered into a leash. The Kuiper Belt Research Facility, designated Tartarus Station, was less a laboratory and more a tomb. Carved into the heart of a barren ice asteroid, it was a place of echoing silence and recycled air, a high-tech prison designed to hold the most dangerous concept humanity had ever encountered. For 6 months, Tartarus became the reluctant home of the Strelka's crew, Admiral Jorik's quarantined heroes. They lived in a state of suspended animation, their lives governed by endless medical scans and psychological debriefings. The 3 Crystalline crew members were housed in a zero-gravity containment field at the station's core. They're perfect. Silent forms a constant, chilling reminder of the entity they had faced. Commander Rostova fought the forced idleness like a caged wolf. She ran grueling physical simulations, maintained a strict command structure among her crew, and filed daily, unheeded requests for active duty. She saw the quarantine not as a safety measure, but as a slow, creeping victory for the Arcadia's philosophy of stasis. They were being solved, not by alien mathematics, but by bureaucratic inertia. Dr. Eris Thorne, however, is not idle. He had been separated from the crew and given a laboratory. A team of brilliant but unnervingly focused scientists from Section 31 in a single, terrifying directive from Agent Kalen weaponized perfection. The project was codenamed Janus, after the two-faced god of beginnings and endings. Eris worked with a growing sense of self-loathing. He was a xenolinguist, a seeker of understanding, yet he was being forced to turn the most profound discovery in history into an instrument of annihilation. Kalen was a constant presence, a shadow in the lab, his quiet encouragement more menacing than any threat. "Imagine it, Doctor," Kalen would murmur, watching Eris model the nullfield's propagation. "An end to war, not through treaties or deterrence, but through a final, irrefutable solution. We point Janus at an enemy fleet, and it ceases to be a threat. It ceases to be anything at all, just a perfect, stable monument to peace." It was the logic of the Arcadia cloaked in the language of military strategy, and it terrified Eris. He knew, with an academic certainty, that a power that absolute could never be controlled. It would inevitably turn on its wielder. He began to subtly sabotage his own research, introducing flawed variables and erroneous calculations into his models, slowing the project's progress under the guise of scientific caution. But the Section 31 scientists were sharp, and Kalen was patient. They had the recordings from the Strelka. They had the telemetry from the Magpie and Icarus probes. And most importantly, they had the 3 crystalline statues. They began their own experiments, bombarding the inert, perfected forms of Telek, Renard, and Joshi with every form of energy imaginable, trying to force a reaction, to understand the physics of the transformation. The breakthrough came not from Eris's theoretical work, but from Rostova's stubborn defiance, in a monitored communication with Eris, a conversation she knew Kalen would be listening to. She spoke of her brother's death, pouring out the messy, illogical grief that had served as her mental shield inside the null field. She spoke of the irrational guilt, the anger at the universe, the chaotic, imperfect memories that refused to fade. In the core containment lab, something happened. As Rostova's raw, emotional voice was piped through the station's comms, the crystalline form of Ensign Telek, the statue of terror, vibrated. A microscopic fracture, a flaw, appeared on its perfect surface. Kalen and his team were ecstatic. They had found a catalyst. It wasn't energy or radiation that could affect the crystalline state. It was raw, chaotic human emotion. They had found the null field's antithesis. The Janus project accelerated at a terrifying pace. They synthesized Rostova's grief, her anger, her illogical pain, encoding it into a carrier wave. They built a device, a grief cannon, as one scientist morbidly joked, designed to project a focused beam of pure, chaotic emotion. Their theory was simple. If a state of perfect order could be weaponized, so could a state of perfect chaos. Their target for the first test was a decommissioned Mandate freighter, towed to a position 1,000 kilometers from Tartarus. Eris watched the preparations on a monitor in his lab, his blood running cold. He had tried to warn them, to explain that they were treating a fundamental force of the universe like a chemistry experiment. But Kalen had simply smiled. "All progress requires risk, Doctor." The test was a catastrophic success. The beam of weaponized grief struck the freighter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the freighter's hull began to unravel. Not explode, but decay at an impossible rate. Rust bloomed and spread in seconds, metal fatiguing and crumbling into dust. The ship's systems went haywire, its reactor fluctuating wildly before collapsing into a singularity of pure, chaotic energy that tore a hole in the fabric of space-time itself. They hadn't just destroyed the ship, they had erased the very concept of its ordered existence, replacing it with a pocket of violent, untethered chaos. Kalen was triumphant. He had his weapon, but Eris saw the truth in the swirling vortex where the freighter had been. They hadn't created an answer to the Arcadia. They had created its opposite. One was a force of absolute wake, static order. The other was a force of absolute nihilistic chaos. Two faces of the same apocalyptic coin. And in testing their weapon, They had just sent a ripple across the universe, a scream of pure chaos that the ultimate mathematician, stewing in its infinite loop, could not possibly have ignored. On the bridge of the Strelka Bissi, still docked within Tartarus Station, an unauthorized alarm began to chime. It was a faint, ghostly signal, a gravitational wave whispering across the void. Rostova recognized it instantly. Arcadia was broadcasting again, but the message had changed. The frantic, looping query of calculate was gone. It had been replaced by a new, single, declarative statement, a theorem that had finally incorporated the paradox of infinity and the new variable of their weaponized chaos. It was a final, terrible synthesis. The message pulsed through Eris's mind, through Rostova's, through the very hull of the station. Perfection is not stillness. Perfection is the balance of all things. Order must solve chaos. Let the final calculation begin. The universe held its breath. The null field of the Arcadia, no longer bound by an unsolvable problem, began to expand again. But this time it was moving, accelerating across interstellar space, heading directly for them. It had a new purpose. It wasn't just a passive state anymore. It was an active force seeking to balance the equation they had so foolishly unbalanced. Kalen saw his folly in an instant. The chaos weapon wasn't a deterrent. It was bait. They had created the very thing the Arcadia now needed to complete its grand, universal proof. On Tartarus Station, chaos erupted. Kalen ordered the Janus weapon to be fired at the approaching null field, a desperate attempt to fight fire with fire. But Eris knew it was useless. You couldn't solve an equation by smashing it with another, opposite equation. You could only make the final answer more catastrophically absolute. He ran from his lab, racing through the corridors toward the Strelka's docking bay, Rostova's voice already echoing in his comms. "Thorn, get to the bridge, we're leaving. Kalen will never let us." Eris panted, dodging panicked scientists. "He has no choice." Rostova's voice came back, cold as ice. "He can die here with his perfect weapon, or he can live with the chaos of escape. I know which one he'll choose." Eris burst onto the Strelka's bridge just as the ship's docking clamps released with an explosive crack. Rostova was in the command chair, her face set like stone, her crew a whirlwind of efficient, controlled motion. On the main viewport, two impossible sights vied for attention. In the distance, the shimmering, starred, distorting edge of the expanding null field, a silent, oncoming wave of absolute order, and closer, emanating from the station's primary weapon array, a swirling vortex of pure chaos, a beam of weaponized grief firing out to meet it. "He's actually doing it," Eris breathed, watching the two fundamental forces of existence rush toward each other. "He thinks he can win. He thinks he can solve the problem," Rostova corrected grimly. "But we learned something he never did. Some problems aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be survived." She turned to her helm officer. "Take us out. Not away from the convergence. Through it." The crew stared at her as if she were insane. "Commander," the navigator began, "the energy readings are off the scale. We'll be torn apart by the tidal forces between order and chaos. Our old physics will be..." "Yes," Eris said, a sudden, wild understanding dawning in his eyes. He looked at Rostova, seeing the same desperate, paradoxical logic that had saved them once before. They couldn't outrun order. They couldn't survive chaos. Their only hope was to find the seam between the two. "Do it," Rostova commanded. The Strelka accelerated, not into the empty void of space, but directly into the blinding flashpoint where the beam of perfect chaos met the wave of perfect order. For an instant, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sensation. The ship, and everyone in it, ceased to exist in any conventional sense, caught in the infinitesimal, absolute 0 point between the two opposing infinities. They were a flaw in the grand equation, a variable that belonged to neither side. And then, the universe blinked. The Strelka was thrown clear, tumbling through a reality that was subtly, fundamentally different. The stars were not in their correct positions. The constellations were alien. On the view screen, Tartarus Station, the Janus weapon, the null field, and the entire Sol system were gone, replaced by a swirling, nascent nebula giving birth to new suns. They hadn't jumped through space. They had jumped through the equation itself, cast out of their own solved universe into a new one, a fresh page where the math had not yet been written. Eris looked at Rostova, his mind reeling with the sheer scale of their escape. They were lost, adrift in an unknown cosmos, the last, chaotic remnants of a reality that had perfected itself into oblivion. They were survivors, Joy. They were a paradox, and, for the first time, in a universe of infinite possibilities, they were truly, perfectly free.